Welcome, everybody. It's a great pleasure to have you join us here this evening for this emergency rally. People are still coming into the meeting. We have hundreds participating and thousands more will be watching it on the live stream and then again on different platforms over the next few days. And this is a real indication of how strongly people feel about this crucial issue. Because this week, the government has announced its intention to increase Britain's nuclear arsenal by 40%. The response has been horror and disbelief across the board. We already have enough nuclear weapons to kill hundreds of millions of people. We know they are illegal. We know they are a criminal waste of money. And now the government is trying to foist more on us. So we are standing up to say no, and we're not alone. The overwhelming majority of people, not only globally, but in Britain, want global abolition of nuclear weapons. And that finds expression in the huge support we are receiving this evening from everyone watching and listening on so many platforms, and also from our speakers who represent the huge breadth of civil society that is speaking out against the new warheads, and who I know will work in alliance with CND in the weeks and months ahead. This is a struggle that we are fighting to win. Our speakers have 3 minutes each, and I'm going to alert them of the time. If you wish to use the chat function, please do to share information. So without further ado, to start what is a packed agenda of speakers, I would like to hand over to our first speaker, the Archbishop of York, Stephen Cottrell, a powerful faith champion for nuclear disarmament. Welcome, Stephen.
Thank you, Kate. It's very good to be with you. Plutarch famously said that when Alexander the Great saw the breadth of his domain, he wept because there were no more worlds to conquer. That is, I suppose, one way of securing peace. You conquer everything. And human history is littered with the stories of empires and war, and with it, the ever more sophisticated ways of killing each other that we concoct. But there is another strand in human history with a bigger vision and a greater hope. It declares that peace is something more than the absence of conflict. It doesn't begin with the conquest of others, but with the conquest of the human heart, putting the needs of others first. For the best way of avoiding war and making peace is collaborative enterprise. Then human communities are so invested in each other and in each other's well-being that war becomes unthinkable. This vision crops up all over the place. Paradoxically, it is as what's tied the United Kingdom together for hundreds of years. It hasn't always worked, but it is a vision worth pursuing. And whatever your view on Brexit, it is a matter of fact that out of the horrors of the Second World War, the Council of Europe was formed, not to create a common currency, but a common destiny, not simply a free trade zone, but peace. The root of this vision, that we belong to each other and must find global solutions with each other, lies in the Jewish Christian revelation of God, who created us one humanity to inhabit one world and whose purposes are those of peace. The Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty of 1968, of which the UK is a signatory, is another example. Its aims to reduce and then eliminate nuclear weapons has been the backdrop for all UK defence policy by all governments ever since. Of course, in CND, we have rightly called for more, but there has been some progress and some reduction in arms, but yesterday's announcement changed this. We are now going to increase our warheads by 40%. That is, we're going to spend more money on more bombs. This is inexplicable, illogical, immoral, legally unjustifiable, and flies in the face of several uncomfortable facts. First, our legal obligations. Second, the success of ICANN in changing the narrative across most nations in the world. Thirdly, the more pressing and immediate needs in our own country as we emerge from the horrors and sorrows of COVID. And fourthly, the fact that the best way of building security, peace, stability in our world is to invest in international aid, not weapons of mass deception. The shortest verse. I've got 30 seconds to go,
Well,
Kate.
your time's almost up,
Yeah.
yes.
The shortest verse in the Bible also speaks of tears. Not tears of regret that there's no more countries to conquer, but the tears of Jesus as he wept at the grave of his good friend Lazarus. I'm really honoured to be speaking this evening. I bring with me the prayers and best wishes of many other Christian and faith leaders in our nation. With Christ, we weep at the grave of our nation's ambition to offer a principled and progressive way forward for the security of our world. This defence strategy is indefensible. However, I do believe in resurrection.
Thank you very much indeed, Archbishop Stephen. That's fantastic. Okay, so now over to our second speaker, who is Lindsey German. Lindsey, known to many of you, is convener of the Stop the War Coalition, and she's been a great friend to CND for almost 2 decades. Lindsey, welcome.
Thanks very much, Kate. And just to say solidarity to CND, thanks for calling this rally, and you can be certain that whatever you're planning with protests and demonstrations that Stop the War will fully support them over this issue and will be part of whatever is going on. Because I very much agree with what you said and what Stephen said, that this is a really shocking decision, even by the standards of this government. And just when you thought you couldn't be shocked by anything in the integrated review, I think it actually has shown a government which is determined to boost its own role of Britain's place in the world, which is looking back to kind of imperial grandeur and being prepared to spend huge amounts of money on the military, on aircraft carriers, on nuclear weapons, in order to maintain this fiction that it has this great role in the world. And at the same time, it's a government which is both callous about its own population and doesn't look to the real issues that are facing us in terms of the environment, in terms of the COVID pandemic, in terms of any of these kind of things. And I'm sure we could all think of very many better ways for money to be spent on these things. So it's a government which is doing this. It's also a government which is cracking down on protests. And as we know, this week, a bill has passed its second reading in Parliament, which actually will make it much, much harder for those of us who want to demonstrate. So it brings together, I think, all these different issues in terms of this increase, this 40% increase in nuclear warheads. But I also think we should look at it in terms of the specifics, because I think there has been an incredible partly cynical and partly just glib way in which the media and politicians now talk about nuclear weapons as though they don't really have any effect. And I think for those of us who grew up in the shadow of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and who learned as we grew up about the terrible effects of those, and to know that each of these warheads is much, much more damaging than the bomb that was dropped on Hiroshima. I think we need to try to bring out these arguments once again. I think that if people understood the consequences of nuclear war, if they understood that nuclear war has absolutely no winners and it is about the destruction of humanity, it seems to me this is one of the main messages that we've got to get across. So I think that is an important issue for us to raise as well as all the other things to do with the treaties, to do with the way in which this government is so recklessly spending money on arms and on the military. So just to conclude, just to say, I think this is a huge issue for all of us on the left, in the peace movement, in the anti-war movement, the trade unions right across the board. I think this is something we all need to take up, and we need to resist and protest as much as we can to make sure they don't get away with it.
Thanks very much indeed, Lindsey. That's brilliant. Just a quick heads up before we go on to our next speaker. For those of you who are in Scotland, I can tell you that immediately following this meeting at 7 p.m, Scottish CND is holding a briefing for Scottish election campaigning. So the link to sign up to that will appear in the chat column. But any Scottish people out there want to get involved, please do link up with that. So on now to our next speaker. It's a great pleasure to welcome someone who's been an inspiration to me in my campaigning for some decades now, if I can say that. Bruce Kent, the Vice President of CND. Bruce, over to you.
Thank you very much, Kate. I hope I can be heard all right.
Yeah.
Anyway, I'm delighted to be here, and congratulations to you on organising such an event. I'd like to take you back a bit to 1946. Most of you will be too young to remember 1946, but I remember there was a big row at the time about nuclear weapons as to whether Britain would go for nuclear weapons or not. And Clement Attlee was very dubious about the whole thing. But he had a big bombastic gentleman on his front bench, and that was Ernest Bevin. And Ernest Bevin was inspired, as most of us were, by straightforward British nationalism. And this is what Bevin said, and I think it swung the argument. We have got to have this thing, nuclear weapons. We've got to have this thing over here, whatever it costs. We've got to have the bloody Union Jack flying on top of it. And the bloody Union Jack has been the kind of inspiration of the right wing all the way through on nuclear weapons. We've reached an insane position now where we claim to have an independent nuclear weapon, but we actually have to borrow the missiles from the United States and have to exchange them. We take them back to the United States and get a new set of missiles. It's no more independent than if I had a family car and I had to borrow the wheels from a neighbor. It's really time that we acknowledge this and got ordinary people to realize, and far more intelligent than spending on absolutely illusory weapons would be far more spending, but it'd be spent it on the National Health Service and the real needs of this country. I think that must be about 2 minutes, so I'm going to shut up now. Thank you all for listening, and thank you all for coming.
That's great, Bruce. Thanks very much, and thanks for your discipline with the time. That was brilliant. So we're going to move without further ado to our next speaker, Baroness Kirsten Blowe. Baroness Blowe is a former General Secretary of the NUT, a trade union with a strong commitment to the cause of peace. Welcome, Kirsten.
Kate, thank you very much, and it's a great pleasure to follow Bruce. It's always a hard act to follow. I just say in passing that when I was still General Secretary of the NUT, our international committee was actually called International Peace and Disarmament. It's called International Solidarity now, but I think peace and disarmament count in solidarity too. Look, friends, there'll be many amongst you on this call tonight who spent a lifetime, or at least what probably seems like a lifetime, campaigning against nuclear weapons. And I'm delighted to have had the privilege from time to time of addressing rallies and standing alongside trade union leaders and great leaders like Bruce, and of course Kate, yourself, and Jeremy Corbyn, people whose leadership on this issue have been absolutely unswerving. And I have so many times found myself making the case for all of the things on which we could spend the ridiculous amount of money that we could save by, for example, not renewing Trident. And I've made the case for defence diversification and for arms conversion. But naively, I guess, I didn't really expect myself at this time, and in the context of heightened awareness of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which of course Britain signed decades ago, and everything that's going on about global and international reduction in nuclear weapons, that we would really be having to have a rally and be campaigning this evening against a proposed, can it really be 40% increase in warheads on what I might, what is already a huge arsenal. It's clearly absolutely incumbent upon all of us here tonight, on this call, but with our friends and neighbours and comrades, to just campaign about this wherever and however we can. Jeremy, I think, will speak later, and he will say that the Peace and Justice Project, of which he is the founder and of which I'm very pleased to be a director, will pick up this area of work, and we've already been working, of course, with Kate. And those of us, I think, who have some kind of parliamentary role absolutely have to find every opportunity to raise our voices, because this is just an utterly unacceptable thing to be happening. And frankly, I think that if we're in schools and we have the opportunity to talk about the importance of peace, then it's something that we absolutely have to be doing. And heading in the direction of increasing our nuclear warheads is just simply something that we shouldn't be doing. So I've been brief, Kate, so that you can get all your speakers in, but I am delighted to have been able to join you and just add my voice this evening. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Christine. That's brilliant. And in particular, can I thank you for the work you're doing on defence diversification? It's incredibly important. So moving on to our next speaker, it's a great pleasure to welcome Julie, Baroness Smith of Newnham. Julie is a Liberal Democrat peer who has been outspoken against the warhead increase. Julie, over to you.
Thank you very much indeed, Kate. I hope everybody can hear me okay. This is the first time I've used this computer. I am a novice here. This is the first time that I have ever spoken at a CND rally, and it never ever occurred to me that I would be speaking at a CND rally. I come from the old SDP. I'm a multilateralist. My party has had a multilateralist position for many years, even though there are many who support the unilateralist movement within the Liberal Democrats. But we are all absolutely united in this sense that we must have nuclear disarmament. We might disagree about how we get there, but we absolutely agree that we should be looking for disarmament, not rearmament or increased armaments. And I read the Guardian headlines and then the integrated review with shock, horror and revulsion. And just as Christine and Bruce have been saying, this absolutely isn't the way the country should be going. We've got commitments under the Non-Proliferation Treaty. And even if we're not breaking the law, we're breaking the spirit of the law. And the idea that somehow the United Kingdom needs to have more nuclear weapons because the world is a dangerous place, but other countries don't. How can we stand up internationally and say that? So certainly from the Liberal Democrat benches, we will be speaking out consistently against what the government is proposing, because it sends absolutely the wrong signals. And as some of my colleagues have been saying, nurses, not nukes. So we absolutely agree that it is vital to be thinking about the wider country and certainly not to be increasing nuclear weapons. We need to reduce them. And that was my 2 minutes.
Thanks very much indeed, Julie. And it may be the first time you've spoken at one of our rallies. I hope it's not going to be the last. So thank you very much for joining us. Just a word to my technical colleagues behind the scenes. We're having questions put in Q&A. That may be because people aren't able to put them in the chat, their comments in the chat. Someone suggested that maybe chat is closed. So I'll leave you to sort that out in the way you think appropriate. So thank you for that. Our next speaker is someone I've had the pleasure of working with, particularly in Parliament for quite some while. That is Caroline Lucas, who's MP for Brittain Pavilion. She's also a Vice President of CND and until very recently was Chair of Parliamentary CND. Caroline, over to you.
Thank you so much, Kate, and thanks to everyone for being here for this important rally. You know, it's so hard to comprehend that we have a Prime Minister who doesn't think that the UK's 180 nuclear warheads are enough, even though that number could wipe out thousands of large cities, kill hundreds of millions of innocent people, create a devastating nuclear winter around the world. He says we need 40% more. We're here to say we do not. We're here to say the possession of nuclear weapons is immoral and illegal. We're here to say that whatever new restrictions this government plans to introduce on protest, we will protest this grotesque, provocative and obscene misuse of resources. You know, yesterday the Foreign Secretary said weapons proliferation in other countries keeps him awake at night. And yet a few sentences later, he was trying to justify our own nuclear non-proliferation treaty obligations being broken. This is weapons grade hypocrisy. So afterwards, I asked the Prime Minister, if global nuclear proliferation happens, as we increase our nuclear warheads by more than 40%, what moral authority can we possibly have to lecture other countries not to do the same? There was no answer. I asked him if we would be more safe or less safe. No answer. And the sheer scale of the aggressive policy changes contained in the government's integrated review need to be exposed. Because with the government wedded to the UK's long-standing refusal to accept a no first use policy, we have to be told what these 80 additional nuclear warheads are for. And will the government admit what we fear, that they will be used first against tactical non-nuclear threats? And what about special status and the obligations as one of the NPT's 3 depositories of the treaty? We're supposed to have a particular role in ensuring that the non-proliferation treaty is properly enforced, and yet we are breaking it. Spending billions on new nuclear warheads is a dangerous diversion of resources, will not protect our communities from climate-related flooding or shield other countries from the extreme impacts of climate change. We will protest, be it online, to keep each other safe, and then back on the streets when we can be together safely. We will be disruptive, we will be noisy, we will have an impact because this Prime Minister, this government is seeking to break the law with its dangerous nuclear plans, and we will not be silent.
Thanks very much indeed, Caroline. That was fantastic. And we'll be there with you. So actually what you referred to then really takes me on to our next speaker, the whole role of protest. And things, well, sometimes things are quite quiet for a while and then suddenly it's incredibly busy. And of course, this week, we've not only had the integrated review and this terrible announcement, of course, we've also had to start the mobilisation to defend our right to protest in the face of the terrible bill being put forward by the government and the shocking scenes that we saw against people on vigils at the weekend. So it's a kind of twofold struggle, and the links, particularly for an organisation with like CND with such a strong protest tradition as well as current protest profile, it's really clear that we're mobilising on both. So it's a pleasure now to welcome Kevin Blowe, who's from Netpol, the initiative which is supporting the new Charter for Freedom of Assembly, which CND is signed up to. So Kevin, over to you.
Thank you so much for inviting me to speak. particularly because the first demonstration that I ever went on was back in 1984 as a 16-year-old at Molesworth Air Force Base in the depths of winter. As others have mentioned, the Police Crime Sentencing and Courts Bill was unveiled last week, and the government has tried to already to ram that through at great haste. What that bill does is incredibly alarming. It introduces a number of new offences, including against noisy protests that may cause what the bill calls serious unease, new offences relating to something called serious annoyance, which is obviously an incredibly subjective sort of idea, and particularly alarming, new powers for the Home Secretary to decide regulations without consulting Parliament on how many of these offences are defined. One of the things that people have said about this bill is that the government will take away our right to protest, and I'm not sure that's entirely true. Protests will continue. A crackdown like this is designed to frighten people off. It's to make it more difficult for us to be able to protest. And the reality is that, as many of the people that are in this meeting will know, that the protests will continue. Groups will go out. They will be noisy. They will be disruptive. That is the nature of what protests are. But what it's likely to mean, unfortunately, is that there is an increase in the number of people arrested and the number of people that are criminalised. Obviously, the first reading of the vote yesterday was passed with a substantial majority, and it was always going to be difficult to challenge a government with an 80-seat majority. And part of what we wanted to do is to try and shift the focus away from just on the bill and say we need to be having a fundamental re-examination of the way that public order policing is conducted. We launched a petition, which I've just been looking at my phone, has passed a remarkable 190,000 signatures, which is calling for the police at a national level to respect national and international human rights obligations through a charter that we've developed through feedback from organisations, including CND. It's a charter for freedom of assembly rights. We know that international human rights laws emerge from the horrors of war. That is part of the reason why it's so important that we protect them. And I really welcome the fact that both CND and Scottish CND have endorsed the charter. There is more information. Kevin. There is more information that will be available, I'm sure, in mailings to come. But if you haven't signed the petition already, please, I urge you to sign it. Thank you for inviting me to your meeting.
Thanks very much indeed, Kevin. That's great. And there's a request in the chat for the petition on policing to be shared. So if you've got the chance, if you could add that to the chat, and just to let people know, my colleagues have told me that the chat function is there if people wish to use it. So thanks, Kevin. And obviously we'll continue to work alongside you and other organisations to make sure that we're not silenced on these absolutely fundamental and crucial issues. So talking of protest, I can say that I've been on a number of the same demonstrations as the next speaker, in fact, probably very many, and that is Lowkey, the musician and campaigner. Welcome, Lowkey.
Thank you very much, Kate. It's an honour to be here. When Boris Johnson says we are ending the era of retreat, what he is saying clearly is that there is more money in the pot for Lockheed Martin.
You can put it on full screen.
Of course, we know that Lockheed Martin are the company that make the Trident missiles, and their stock rose by over 2% following the announcement. In November, when the British government announced the increase in military spending, BAE stock rose by 3% the next day. What does their increase in military spending represent? Well, it means that over the next 4 years, they'll be spending almost over, actually, £200 billion pounds on hardware which can kill. And remember, BAE Systems, despite the largesse that it is afforded by the British state, it only represents 0.6% of British GDP. Now, this is an astonishing development at a time where we see that both the the leader of Russia, Putin, and Biden have made clear that they will continue their reductions, how is it that Britain is increasing theirs? And it's actually the second arms-based decision where Britain seems to have veered to the right of the United States, the first being the refusal to stop selling weapons to the Saudi government. We've seen 10.3 billion pounds worth of weapons sold to Saudi Arabia over the last decade, and it's bombed the world's poorest people in Yemen and drove them into starvation. Now we see the British government slashing aid to them by 60%, and in some cases we see cuts to aid to conflict zones as high as 90%. When we're in a situation where 77% of the UK public have made clear that they support a ban on nuclear weapons, how can this possibly be construed as part of the public and defending the public interest? Also, when we think about the fact that the UK military and arms companies have been identified by Matt Kennard as producing more carbon emissions than 60 individual countries, when we know that Britain supposedly is promising to ban new fossil fuel vehicles by 2030, what do we suppose that all of this new hardware is going to be fueled by, and how?
30 seconds, Lowkey.
Sorry, say that again, Kate.
30 seconds, please.
So we're in a situation where 1.4 million people throughout the lockdowns have had no recourse to public funds. We've got 14.5 million people in poverty, spending this amount of money when studies have shown that for every billion invested in the arms trade, you could produce thousands more jobs if they were invested in healthcare and education. We see the continued transfer of funds to shadowy interests within the British establishment.
Thanks very much indeed. And your point about jobs, particularly in healthcare, is so well made at this point when we're experiencing this terrible pandemic. So thank you very much indeed, Lowkey. Look forward to seeing you on further demonstrations when we're allowed to. Same applies to our next speaker, Victoria Brittain. Victoria is a journalist, author and campaigner for human rights, particularly in Palestine. Victoria, over to you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for organising this magnificent outpouring of rage. I am extremely honoured to be part of it, and I want to start by reminding us, or reminding anybody who's listening, that nuclear weapons are completely immoral. They're absolutely immoral and an outrageous insult to the memories of Nagasaki and Hiroshima. And we shouldn't for a second allow somebody in 10 Downing Street to forget what Hiroshima really meant. And it has to be up there, and anybody who can speak in Parliament or anywhere where those people can listen, let's always highlight Hiroshima. Like, as everybody has said, the figures being announced were just so stunning. It was really hard to take it in that this was being seriously put forward. And of course, our protest and the immense outpouring against it is going to mean it's not going to happen. But what it is a very important extra part of what we're witnessing in the militarizing of our society. Who knew that Britain would become the 4th biggest spender on weapons in the world, ahead of Russia, France, Germany? This is not who we want to be, and we have to in every way fight against the normalization of what these people are trying to do to us. And as others have said, that the idea that you can spend or think about spending this kind of money in a society where nurses, teachers, all kinds of key workers who we've all depended on during this year of the pandemic are having their pay actually cut. It's just completely unacceptable. And all I want to say is that I hope that each and every one of us can raise such outrage that people, and it was wonderful that we started with those words from the bishop. I think this is an inspiration. Everybody who's spoken has been great. And thank you again, Kate, for organising it.
Thanks so much. Thanks so much, Victoria. That's brilliant. Bit of rage is a good thing. Okay, over to our next speaker, Paul Rogers. Paul is Professor Emeritus at Bradford University Department of Peace Studies. Paul, over to you.
Kate, thanks very much indeed for organising this, and it's really an honour to be with you and to be here. A few minutes ago, Eileen Braben put a question on chat, and she asks, why is this happening now? Why is this expansion? It doesn't make any sense. Kevin was talking earlier on about his being involved in his first demonstration at Molesworth in 1984. I think it was a year after that that CND published a booklet called The Death of Deterrence, and explained that the idea of the last resort of a nuclear weapon was in many ways false, and they were seen from the start by the strategists as war-fighting weapons. I think it was that same year I met up with that personally. I was at basically a briefing at NATO about NATO nuclear policy, and over coffee I got to talking to a German planner who was part of the nuclear planning group, and he was waxing eloquent about the use of demonstration shots. And he said, look, if the Soviets came across the border, we'd fire 5 low-yield air-burst nuclear weapons, and that would stop them in their tracks. There's been that line of thinking in nuclear theology, if I can use that term, and please forgive me, Archbishop, for using such a term. It's been part of nuclear planning right from the start. You go back to the 1950s, the early 60s, when Britain first had them, there was talk about using nuclear weapons against China before it had nuclear weapons. Nuclear weapons were on task force ships in the Falklands War. There was talk at cabinet minister level of the possibility of using nuclear weapons in response to Saddam Hussein using chemical weapons in the Gulf War back in 1991. This is not new. And although Trident is the only system that Britain has, and as many people have pointed out, it's incredibly potent, each of the missiles carries many warheads, standard 3, but it can be many more. And each of those warheads can actually be as powerful as 12 Hiroshimas. But there's also a version of Trident, which nobody talks about in polite circles, which is much low yield. Now, the term yield is a bad term to use, it's explosive force. And the point is that element of Trident is actually a war-fighting element. And the most chilling thing about what's been said in the last couple of days is this idea that we might use nuclear weapons against a power that has staged some sort of cyber attack against us to sort of deter a cyber attack. That is the kind of thinking which is massively dangerous. And I'm afraid, Eileen, I suspect very strongly that one of the answers to your absolutely valid and reasonable question is that we don't know why there's been this increase. I would hazard a guess it's something more about making us more able to actually use nuclear weapons in that terrible phrase, small nuclear wars in far off places. It means the work we do, the work CND does, is hugely important and must be expanded. Thank you, Kate.
Thanks very much indeed, Paul. That's great. I've been wondering actually when they're saying about these new warheads or additional warheads, what kind of warheads are they talking about? So I think that's an incredibly important avenue for us to explore. I mean, perhaps parliamentary questions on that for parliamentarians present would be absolutely essential. So talking of parliamentarians, Baroness Jenny Jones is our next speaker. She's a Vice Chair of Parliamentary CND and a parliamentary activist against nuclear weapons. Jenny, over to you.
It's very good to be here this evening. Thank you for inviting me. I feel very honoured to be amongst such a fantastic company and some very good friends, of course. As I never tire of telling Kate, my first ever demo, and I've been to a lot of demos by now, was with CND in 1968. And at that point I thought, well, so many people, how could we possibly not succeed in actually stopping this? And now, of course, all those years later, I can't even begin to remember, 50 years later, And we are in a situation where we have a government that expands our nuclear arsenal. Now, people have asked why they think it's happening. And I think part of this is that we have a government that is out of control. They have now, for the last more than a year, have had an 80+ majority in the House of Commons. And even Conservatives in the House of Lords are beginning to be very concerned about the number of bills we get through that actually increase government powers. What's happening again and again is that we get secondary legislation, which we can't amend, where ministers actually have the power to change things. And the policing bill is an example of this. The policing bill is a terrible bill, and we will, of course, try to fight it. It's 300 pages and 176 clauses. So it's going to be quite a battle. And of course, the government wanted to rush it through, but they've failed in doing that. But it will be carried over, I'm sure, to the next session. I'm sure everybody knows that the Green Party is fully behind CND and its aims. And I will be out on the streets with you as soon as it's legal. And I will be arguing in Parliament as well. And I'm very happy to ask parliamentary questions on this issue and just keep pushing as much as we possibly can. I think that the biggest danger that we are facing is obviously our climate emergency. But this government doesn't seem to even be able to make the tiniest baby steps towards actually fighting that problem, and yet they think that other countries are the problem in terms of perhaps attacking us or, as other speakers have said, perhaps using them in tiny wars a long way away. I would finally like to say that CND is the most incredible organisation, and we should all be pleased to be part of it. And I just hope that the government will see sense and actually stop this very foolish move that they're making when they give 1% increase to nurses, to the NHS, and they increase our nuclear arsenal by 44%. You have to ask, how competent are they? And unfortunately, we've got at least another 4 years of this government. And so we're going to have to fight as much as we possibly can. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much indeed, Jenny. I think struggle on many fronts is what's ahead of us, but we're going to be struggling together. Okay, so our next speaker, it's a pleasure to welcome Andrew Feinstein. Andrew is a former Member of Parliament in South Africa, and he's Director of Shadow World Investigations, which looks, amongst other things, at corruption in the global arms trade. Over to you, Andrew.
Thank you very much, Kate. It is great to be here and an enormous honor to appear on this panel with such illustrious and committed people. I want to talk about a slightly different aspect of this increase that we've heard about. As you mentioned, I have done a lot of work, both in book form, in film form, and various others, on corruption in the arms trade. The global trade in conventional and nuclear weapons accounts for 40% of all corruption in all global trade. So this is an industry that in a good year is worth about $400 billion, which is not a huge amount of money, but nevertheless accounts for 40% of all corruption. That corruption is a consequence of collusion between the most senior politicians, senior military leaders, and crucially, political parties, all of whom benefit from this corruption. So if we look at what is probably the most corrupt commercial transaction in commercial history, the Al Yamama arms deal between the UK and Saudi Arabia, the son of Margaret Thatcher, the Prime Minister who signed the deal, was paid a bribe of £12 million on the deal. The executive chairman of BAE Systems benefited to the tune of £6.5 million, and the Tories received hundreds of thousands of pounds from the main intermediary or arms dealer on the transaction. In addition to which, both the defense secretary at the time and Britain's ambassador to Saudi Arabia at the time, when they retired, went straight onto the board of BAE Systems, at that time probably the most corrupt company in the world, which made billions of pounds in profits from that transaction. So the reality is, when we increase our 40% of nuclear warheads, as we are now doing, you not only see the disastrous and devastating consequences that the panelists so far have mentioned, but what we are doing is we are lining the pockets of what I describe as the national security elite, both in the United Kingdom and globally. So effectively, they are increasing our nuclear arsenal using our tax pounds, with us suffering the socioeconomic opportunity costs of that, which is a decrease in spending on things like healthcare and education that are so vital at the moment. And all of this is being done in our name. A huge thank you to CND for bringing us all together to say not in our names. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Andrew. Those issues are often not investigated enough in terms of our campaigning on nuclear weapons. So thank you very much for making that so clear. Our next speaker is Kirsten Bayes. Kirsten is representing Campaign Against Arms Trade, crucial in this field. Kirsten is also Vice Chair of the Nuclear Information Service, which investigates the UK's nuclear weapons programme. Kirsten, over to you.
Thank you, Kate, and to everyone involved with this wonderful event. Every nuclear submarine that's ever been built by the UK still exists. Relics from the Cold War, they're sitting waiting to be scrapped on the quaysides of Rosyth and Devonport. This government's nuclear policy is a similar hangover from the Cold War. Without any public consultation or debate, the government decided in secret to break international law, to ignore its responsibilities under the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and to commit this country to a new generation of Trident nuclear warheads. And it's doing this, increasing the number of warheads by more than 40%. 260 warheads, with, as we've heard, the largest of them as big as a dozen Hiroshimas. They've said very little about the cost of the new warheads, but it's likely to be in the billions. Billions of pounds funneled to arms companies and military contractors. As Andrew just said, lining the pockets of the global elite. And they're doing this at a time when the world is facing real challenges. A global pandemic, climate change, huge economic uncertainty, and a massive humanitarian crisis in Yemen because of a war being fought with British-made weapons. This decision is unconscionable. Our arms company engineers and supply chain workers have the ideal skills to drive a green revolution away from industries that fuel conflict and oppression. It's high time the UK focused its resources on meeting human needs for housing, healthcare, and protection from the effects of poverty and climate change, and turned its back on nuclear weapons for good. Like the aging submarines, it's time to scrap our addiction to nuclear weapons. So well done, and solidarity to everyone here working so hard to make that happen. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Kirsten, and solidarity with Kat. You have a difficult struggle, I know, but we're with you.
Thank you.
So now it's a pleasure to welcome our next speaker. Our next speaker is Jeremy Corbyn MP. He's Vice President of CND. He's former leader of the Labour Party, and he's founder of the new Peace and Justice Project. Jeremy, over to you. Welcome.
Kate, thank you very much. And you can see the joy of our symbol behind you, and it's very carefully designed so it can never be upside down. A lot of thought went into that design. Can I say thank you, Kate, for organising this, and what an amazing and wonderful panel of speakers we've got here tonight, because the issue of nuclear weapons can never be forgotten. And I think to say it's non-negotiable is a rather odd thing to say. Every policy is debatable. Every policy is negotiable. That is what a democratic society should and must be about. I think we unfortunately have a generation who write our newspapers, run our media, and many people who are simply unaware of the power of nuclear weapons, that every one of the new nuclear warheads the Prime Minister is proposing to buy is infinitely more powerful than the single warhead that killed hundreds of thousands of people in Hiroshima 70 years ago, and also continued to kill people from cancers ever since then. Our peace movement grew in the horrors of the 1950s with the growth of the Cold War and the crazy stockpiling of weapons by both the Soviet Union, the USA, Britain, and France, and later joined by China in doing this. But the peace movement should never be written off, never be forgotten, and never be ignored. We achieved the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. We achieved the ABM Treaty. We achieved the Test Ban Treaty. We achieved the nuclear-free zones around the world. And a lot of people who were inspired by those successes went on to demand the Global Ban Treaty, which has now been supported by almost 60 countries in the United Nations who've ratified it, and over 80 that have already signed it. It is a massive global movement. Now, I support the Global Ban Treaty and would want to see it implemented. Now, I think this review, and I've been reading it and I'm reading the Prime Minister's comments on it that were in Parliament yesterday, is one massive missed opportunity. My sadness is I couldn't be in the House of Commons yesterday to take part in that debate because I was defending a libel action in court. But don't worry, I'll be around and say plenty more about it on every other conceivable occasion. Had we won the election, the first thing I would have done is ordered a full security review. And that security review would have looked at what are the real issues about security around the world. The real issues thrown up by the COVID crisis, the real issues of environmental degradation, destruction, loss of biodiversity, the real issues of global economic inequality widened massively by the COVID crisis, and a further recession will widen that even further. And
30 seconds, Jeremy, please.
70 million people around the world are refugees who are victims for all of those things. We need a global movement, a global debate, which will look at the real issues of security, not another Cold War, not billions wasted on weapons of mass destruction, which will, at the end of the day, cost a great deal of money, hopefully never be used, but of course, their very existence does threaten life on our planet as a whole. That's what I'm absolutely determined to be part of, that global movement to bring about the Ban Treaty.
Thanks very much indeed, Jeremy, and thanks for the work that you're doing with your new project, particularly to raise awareness of the Global Ban Treaty. I think so many people don't know about it. There seems to be almost a media blackout about it. So I think getting that message out there and the work you're doing is incredibly important.
Thank you, Kate.
So to our next speaker, Nick Dearden. Nick is Director of Global Justice Now, and he's been a strong part of our anti-Trident alliance for over a decade. Welcome, Nick.
Thanks very much, Kate. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for inviting me. You get to the stage of wondering when we won't need CND anymore, when the world will become rational and sane enough that we can't even conceive of spending this kind of money on increasing our stockpile of weapons of mass destruction. But clearly that day is not today. So I'm very, very pleased you're here and that you've organised us tonight. Look, as everybody said, in the middle of a global pandemic, when we're cutting aid in half to countries like Yemen, a country whose destruction Britain is complicit in because of its weapons sales to Saudi Arabia, it's absolutely obscene that we're considering spending billions on increasing our nuclear stockpile. But even if we did have the money, it's hard to think of a worse way to spend it. Why on earth does the British Prime Minister seem to believe he has the right to blow up the entire planet? I have never quoted the sun positively at a rally before, but I'm going to, because the editorial from The Sun this morning had a line in it in bold: aren't 180 city-destroying bombs enough? The Times warned this morning this is likely to lead to nuclear proliferation. Of course it will. If you're trying to convince governments around the world that they don't need nuclear weapons, it's hardly helpful to say that 180 isn't enough for us. That's how unhinged this government is. Even The Sun and The Times think this is completely crazy. And I should say, by the way, it's not the only problematic aspect of the awful strategy paper the government outlined yesterday. Included in that strategy is spending millions of pounds sending naval warships to the Pacific, which is all part of Boris Johnson's plan to project British sea power east of Suez for the first time in half a century. The whole thing is a shocking confirmation that this Prime Minister is actually governing the country based on some kind of a deluded imperial fantasy that he presumably developed as a schoolboy. Dominic Raab told the press yesterday that democracy was in retreat across the world, and that was one reason why we needed more nuclear weapons. Well, he's certainly doing his best, and the government is certainly doing their best to make that so. When Boris Johnson became the leader of the Tory party, I think many of us were seriously worried that here we had somebody who had very few limits, very few constraints on what he would do to cling on to power. And I think we're seeing that play out here. This government is extremely dangerous. It's very, very wrong, not just on this, but across a whole spectrum of foreign policy announcements that they've made over the last year. And we need to get ready to fight them across the board. And I'm really, really pleased that we're coming together tonight to do this. I think they have very, very little support for this policy. And therefore, I think we can beat them. So let's get to it. Thank you, Kate.
Thanks very much, Nick. And look forward to working with you in the weeks and months ahead. That's brilliant. Quite a few of us have talked about the health service and the incredible work that's been done over the past year and the importance of real funding for the health service. So it's a pleasure to welcome our next speaker, Lesley Morrison. Lesley is a retired GP in the Scottish Borders, and she's speaking on behalf of Medact, which is the health professionals campaigning for a better world. Lesley, over to you. We can't
Thank
see.
you, and thank you very much for Thank you, and thank you very much for inviting me. And it's particularly wonderful to see Bruce Kent, who I haven't seen for years, and he's always been such an inspiration, as several people have said. So, hello, Bruce. Medact and its predecessor, the Medical Campaign Against Nuclear Weapons, has been campaigning since 1980 to say that nuclear weapons the effects of nuclear weapons cannot be treated. There's no point calling the doctor, there's no point trying to engage the health service, and the effects of nuclear weapons can't be dealt with by health professionals.
Lesley, I'm just going
prevention
to
is the only way forward.
Lesley, I'm just going to interrupt you. You haven't got your camera on, and there's a big demand to see you, unless you don't want to be seen. But I think your camera was on earlier, so if you're happy to put it on.
According to my machine, oops.
Okay, don't worry, just carry on. Oh no. Have we lost? Oh no, sorry everybody, I should have, but there was a demand there to see her. So I'm just going to give her a moment to come back in. There you are, Lesley. Don't worry about the camera, just carry on. Okay, go ahead, Lesley.
I apologise for that. The technology is not stretching to Scotland, I'm afraid. Yes, as I was saying, Medact and our predecessor medical campaign against nuclear weapons has been saying that we cannot treat the effects of nuclear weapons. Prevention is better than cure. And as many speakers have said, the money that's being absolutely atrociously wasted in nuclear weapons is money that we desperately need in the health service. After the TPNW came into law, the British Medical Association, the BMA, put out a statement saying, we believe it's a global health imperative to eliminate nuclear weapons. So the treaty and the prohibition of nuclear weapons entering into force today marks a humanitarian victory for the international medical community, and through the medical community, the entire global community. So our professional organisations are signed up to this. The Medact's a thriving organisation in response to what's happening internationally. We've produced the ICANN Cities Appeal Action Pack. So what we're going to be saying to our members in terms of how we respond to this awful development is we get out on the streets, as people have said. We encourage people to look at the Medact website, where the ICANN Cities Appeal Action Pack is. It's a very easy, very effective pack to use to campaign with councillors, local representatives. And with the upcoming Scottish elections, we encourage people to use the power of the vote to vote in a Scottish government that is going to speak out against Trident. So as health professionals, we're using our voice for this incredibly important humanitarian health issue. Thank you very much for inviting us.
Thanks very much indeed, Lesley. Sorry about our little technical blip, but it's great to hear your voice, so thank you. So over to our final speaker. Our final speaker is Kirsten Oswald, MP for East Renfrewshire. Kirsten is Deputy SNP Leader in the Westminster Parliament, and she is also the new Chair of Parliamentary CND. So welcome, Kirsten.
Thanks so much, Kate, and it is really great to be here with so many of you. I think that the plans that the UK government has set out to increase the number of nuclear warheads in its arsenal for the first time since the Cold War are so troubling to so many people. And I think that's particularly the case in the context of the UK government's own worldview, their own priorities, a bull-headed, blustering approach to finding their new place in the world. And that's one that undoubtedly makes us all less safe and less secure. And I think we need to be clear on how this will look beyond these shores too. It's dangerous, it's perplexing, and it is very foolish. These cannot be the priorities that we live by. And remember, people don't support this. It's very clear that people don't want more nuclear weapons. In fact, we know that people don't want nuclear weapons at all, anywhere. But here we are, the UK government will increase its stockpile of nuclear weapons. Never mind that people don't want it, never mind it contravenes the UK's obligations under the Non-Proliferation Treaty, never mind they're willfully ignoring the UN Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. And as for the statement in the integrated review that says that the UK government is strongly committed to full implementation of the Non-Proliferation Treaty in all its aspects, including nuclear disarmament, well, that's plainly nonsense, and they know that. And I have to say, as an MP representing a constituency in the west of Scotland, I already struggle to get my head around the fact that weapons of mass destruction are located not much more than a stone's throw away from where my children go to school, just up the road from Scotland's most populous city. So to hear that Boris Johnson wants to build up this obscene arsenal of weapons, I actually can't comprehend that. There's already enough nuclear capacity there to wipe millions and millions of people from the face of the planet. And worse, the government won't even tell us the detail of what they're doing because they're going to stop publishing that, almost as if they're trying to hide something, perhaps the cost, amongst other things. The whole thing is obviously morally outrageous. And it's also incoherent in military terms too. These plans do nothing to help with the real threats and challenges of today and tomorrow. It'll do nothing for our security, but a great deal to make us and the world a less safe place. And it says all kinds of terrible things about the priorities of the UK government when they'd rather pay unfathomable sums of money to build up their stocks of weapons of mass destruction rather than support nurses' pay or feed hungry children. I think the contrast between the governments in London and Edinburgh couldn't be writ more starkly than it is today, with the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child written into Scots law on the same day that the Westminster Parliament decided to up the ante with its ballooning nuclear arsenal. I really liked what the earlier speaker said about nurses, not nukes. I'd say focus on bairns, not bombs, but the principle is the same. The UK government don't speak for me on this. They're wrong and they're out of step with people. There's no place for these nuclear weapons in Scotland or anywhere else for that matter. We're not going away, and this will never be in our name. And thank you again, Kate, for inviting me to speak today.
Thanks very much indeed, Kirsten. That's brilliant. And I look forward to working with you in your new role with Parliamentary C&D. It's brilliant to have you on board. Well, that's the end of the meeting, the end of the contributions from our wonderful speakers. I'd like to thank them all very much indeed. I'd like to thank all of you who are watching for sharing this discussion with us tonight. And I think that the strength of the meeting this evening is a real sign of the scale and breadth of opposition to nuclear weapons across our society. It's absolutely immense. And we know that we're facing many challenges today. Many different issues are coming up seemingly on a daily basis that we need to mobilise around. But I think they all really come down to one issue, which is what kind of society do we want to live in? What kind of world do we want to see? And I believe that we all share the vision of a just and peaceful world without exploitation and oppression, and certainly without nuclear weapons. So thank you for coming this evening. Please join with us. If you're not a member of C&D, please do join up, work with us and fight with us for the kind of society that we want to live in. Thank you very much to everybody.